Good morning, everyone. This is Peter Dew here, and welcome to the webinar, 6 Ways to Create Great Content that Influences Your Audience. So I want to share with you today some strategies for working out what you're going to put in terms of content and your messages, and ones that are not just important to you, but on the other side, are influential, persuasive, and have impact on your audience. You've got my contact details. If you need more information, follow me on LinkedIn, connect with me on LinkedIn, follow me on Facebook. And if I can assist you beyond this webinar, please make use of me. How to participate in the webinar. There's a couple of new names on the webinar. Please ask questions as we go. Take notes and don't wait for me to stop and say, are there any questions? In fact, type in comments or your own experiences as we go, and I can deconstruct them or maybe weave my content around your comments. And it may be a previous time when you also struggled to create content. Most importantly, think and apply the information to your own unique situation. Have you previously delivered a presentation where the content didn't seem to have the impact you wanted with the audience? So ask questions, take notes, and apply the information I share with you to your own situation. The best way to do that is think of a past presentation, or maybe you've got one coming up. Is there anything you're going to do differently as a result of what you hear from me today? And of course, in an ideal world, every one of you on the webinar will take away 1 or 2 things which I share with you and incorporate that into your next presentation. So let's get started. First things first, why bother to create great content that influences your audience? We know that nonverbal communication is so important. We know that you need to connect and build rapport. We know you need to look confident. You have to have a really good presence, and you need to invest in knowing your audience. So surely average content will do. The reality is, even though the spoken word may be only 8% or 10% of an entire presentation, content is still king. Brilliant body language, brilliant connection, a great understanding of your audience, cultural nuances, all of those things are really important. But if you deliver rubbish or content that misses the mark, you won't have the impact. So the content needs to be good content, needs to be relevant to the people in the room. And it needs to inspire or move or challenge the audience to doing things differently. Generally, we get before an audience because we want something to happen after we've spoken. Some new knowledge, a new way of doing things, for them to consider or embrace a new policy direction. So content is important if you want to create that movement. If you're standing up and speaking and you really don't expect anything to happen after you've spoken, then by definition you're a stand-up comedian, which is fine, Even stand-up comedians still have great content sometimes. So let's get started. The first thing for great content, solve a problem for the audience. Help them get over a barrier. Help them move forward. Help them unlock something that's happening for them. If your presentation gives the people a way forward, a way of solving a problem, then that'll be great content. And I often tell people to really study your audience and find out what that problem is. The metaphor that I sometimes use that relates to this one is, what headache are you the paracetamol for in that room, in that audience? What's the big problem that they're facing? What's keeping them awake at night? What are they worrying about in their workplace? And how does your message or an aspect of your message solve that problem for them? So the first thing that we should all do is make sure that your content solves a problem. The second way of creating great content is to tell a story, share a story. And it's not just a bedtime story or an entertaining story. Even inspirational stories by themselves don't necessarily have impact. It's important that the story carries a point that's relevant to your core message, a point that's relevant to your content, and even more importantly, that point must have a benefit or a value to the people in the room. So it looks a little bit like this, and excuse my drawing. So you tell a story. In the story, you make a point. And from that point, the audience gets some value or a benefit, i.e., that headache I spoke to in point one would be one example of creating content. So you tell a story that highlights a point that gives value or a benefit to the people in the room. A great way of doing this is make your audience the heroes. Too many people tell inspirational stories and they've done fantastic stuff, I acknowledge that, and they are the heroes and the story is entirely about them. And the audience walks out maybe inspired and thinking that you're a wonderful person and that you've done a really great job, but they haven't moved in their lives. So as a speaker, you haven't been influential or persuasive. You haven't created an opportunity for change or for adopting new ideas. So try and make your audience part of the story. The story is for the audience. If you tell a story and you have no point, then what's the point? Well, you may be an entertainer or a stand-up comedian, and that's fine. Even inspirational speakers have a point. If you tell a story and you make a point, and I don't care, and I'm in the audience member, and we don't care, then you just become a nice story. If you tell a story, you make a point, and you give me some value or some benefits, some advantage of your story, I can see how this applies to me, and I feel as though I'm part of your story and I am part of the hero of your story, then I'm going to take traction. I'm going to change. I'm going to do things differently as a result of listening to your story. So that's how we use stories. Stories are a fantastic way of creating change. And two reasons why stories are very powerful. There's more than two reasons, but two reasons I love to use. Number one, I don't need to write or script or learn my story. I've lived my story. The second point is that people can't discredit my story. It's my own journey. It's my own case study. It's the very project that was going pear-shaped that I intervened and brought it back on track and returned it to budget. That's my unique intellectual property. So your stories, and I'm talking about business stories, your stories are your unique intellectual property. And we know that if the story transports people on an emotional journey, so there's highs and lows and surprises and twists, then people are more likely to remember that story. It creates what's called the emotional or the visceral response, the gut response. If you just use data and facts, that appeals to the neurological response, but to have more impact, along with the data and the facts and the break-even analysis, what story is going to help us remember what you want us to do? Are there any comments on using stories? I do a bit of work in the mining sector, Chevron, oil and gas, Rio Tinto, BHP, and at safety meetings. And it takes a while for them to realise that they can use a story. And the story they use is the near miss. And it can be a story from outside of their workplace, so they can make the story anonymous, where someone was driving fatigued and ended up in the ditch. And just a little bit further on wasn't the ditch, was in fact the whole pit, the deep pit. And the closeness of that story to being a fatal accident in highlighting the point of why you don't drive tired, or the other 4 steps before getting into a vehicle that they apply when driving on mine sites. The right story, that people remember the near miss. All right. Give people a way forward. I call this show them the light at the end of the tunnel. I work a lot in the disability field and the health and the community services. And they work with people, aged care, stressed families, people with intellectual, physical disabilities, that funding is quite tough. And so I'm working with workers, disability services staff, and they're often the advocates. They're often the people that go out to communities and talk about what the options are. So in creating your content, if you can give people hope, create a light bulb moment, show them that there is success around the corner, then they will remember and be more prepared to accept your message. So think of a family that's got a child with an intellectual disability. The burden of that family, they're struggling with funding, they're struggling with respite, both parents still have to work, and their service provider, they've got some funds, but just a limited amount of funds for their child, and the service provider speaks to them and talks to them about connecting them with other families, with a support group, and has found an alternative way of providing respite. So 1 weekend a month, the parents can go away while their child is properly looked after. And by applying for this grant or doing this particular thing, they can access an extra $50 a week that's going to make a difference to the way they live. Show people the way forward. Show people light at the end of the tunnel. This is a great way of creating content. How am I going to be inspired by what you're showing me? What light is at the end of the tunnel? And this links back to overcoming a problem. But it doesn't have to be a problem. It can be a way forward. It can also be a way of creating further success. So give people a way forward. I'm just going to pause for a moment, see if there's any questions. So Steve, you've got a question going back to storytelling. I will just toggle back. Storytelling, and yes, engineers and geologists struggle more with storytelling. This is what I do just to illustrate and to let them know that a very high level person can use business storytelling. So I need to borrow a story here. Andrew Thorburn is the CEO of the National Australia Bank. So fair to say he's well paid, highly regarded. I think his income's about $12 million a year. Has to work really hard to get there. He had a meeting, and I heard this from the coach of Andrew Thorburn, who taught him how to do storytelling. And Andrew Thorburn started a meeting where he wanted a change management process to occur. And he was talking about the importance of modeling the way. In other words, all the directors and the chief financial officers, so the C-suite, had to do the change that the National Australia Bank was going through, not just articulate it and expect their workers to follow, their bank managers to follow. They needed to model or be the way So Kuzner and Posner in the Leadership Challenge talk about modeling the way as one of the things that leaders need to do. So that's the data, that's the fact, there's a reason, there's business, there's lots of neurological reasons why you would do that. But Andrew Thorburn said, and guys, as you know, on the weekend, I was teaching my son how to drive, my 17-year-old son, Simon. He's on his learners and I took him out for a drive. We're driving down the freeway and he went to change lanes and he indicated 3 times, flick, 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 and then just moved across. I cringed, we nearly hit a car, and I said to him, Simon, that's not how you change lanes. The correct way to change lanes is to indicate, maybe 3, 4, 5 times, look over your shoulder, check in your rear vision mirror, give people time to accelerate or slow down to let you in, and then you merge when it's safe. And Simon said to me, yes, Dad, I know that's the way to do it. I was just changing lanes the way you change lanes. And then I realized that the way I drive is exactly the way my son drives. And if I want him to drive in a different way, then my behavior, I need to change my behavior. I need to model the way I want my son to drive. So guys, in National Australia Bank, as we move through this difficult time and this change management process, all of us need to model this new way. And it was the story that people got. So yes, if the CEO of National Australia Bank can tell a story to his C-suite executives, I think a geologist, a mining engineer, a CEO of another organisation can also use storytelling. So brilliant. Thanks for that question. The fourth way is about brevity, concise, and targeting the message. So you really need to find out what that message is. And I tell people that as a general rule, after you've spoken for 15 minutes, 30 minutes, you've done a 45-minute keynote at a conference, 3 months later, people are going to only remember one thing. And far better that you make sure that you control and determine what that one thing is. One of the ways that people speak is they do what I call scattergun approach, and they say lots of stuff and they give lots of messages and they hope that something sticks. But they don't have control over which of the messages sticks. So I guess if we look at that one there, there's a lot of shots and each audience member might walk away with a different arrow. In a targeted message, all of the arrows would hit the bullseye. So that unequivocally, without a doubt, at the conclusion of your presentation, everyone's on the same page. They've got the same big message, that concise message. I understand there'll be subpoints and there'll be rationale behind it, but the big overarching message should be really targeted and really concise. We only remember one thing after you've spoken. Our concentration span is about 30 seconds. That's why TV adverts only go for 30 seconds. That's why news stories on the news, they're 30 seconds. The newsreader speaks for about 8 seconds. You cross to the field with the live interview for about 10, 12 seconds. Then they cross back to the newsreader who sums up and puts the ending on the story, 30 seconds. So what's your big message? Make it concise and make it targeted. Avoid the scattergun approach and saying lots of stuff and hoping that something will stick. So I did a workshop in Melbourne on Monday this week. I got back yesterday from Melbourne and I was teaching this principle, and one person spoke about water and the Murray River. Being in Victoria, a lot of the regional cities rely on the Murray River for their water source. And at the end of every person's 2-minute presentation, I get the other members in the audience, the other 8 or 9 people, to write down the core message. In an ideal world, we'd all read out the same core message. And what came out was one person said, well, Bill is talking about we need to identify additional water sources other than the Murray. And the other person said, no, Bill's talking about recycling water. So after we've used it, we can capture it, purify it, and reuse it for drinking water. And the third person said, no, Bill is talking about we need to reduce the amount of water we use. Australia is the thirstiest nation, yet we've got the smallest freshwater drinking supplies, yet we use more water than most nations. And when I went back to Bill, I said, so which was your core message? And he said, yeah, I've kind of left 3 different messages. And I guess in reality, additional water sources are not what I'm talking about. I'm really talking about conservation of water. So we need to use less water. That's my big overarching message. Have a clear next step or action. So for your content, ask people to do something. One of the things I notice when I attend conferences and I listen to other speakers, they can be very engaging, very passionate, and then they stop speaking. So their time's up, they finish speaking, they smile, everyone claps, but they don't put that hook of asking people what to do next. What is your call to action? This is another way of creating influential content. Ask the audience to do something. And depending on what you're talking about, it may be going back to your office and implementing this new health and safety policy straight away. If you're within the disability field, it may be asking everyone to write to the Minister for Disability Services or the local government to get Western Australia to sign up to the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which they have signed up to in a different format. But for a while they didn't sign up. So what do you want them to do? Leave that clear next step. And this will help you craft your content. And one of the ways in preparing a presentation, one of the things I teach is start at the end. Remember, unless you're an entertainer or a stand-up comedian, generally we speak for a reason, and that is because we want the behavior, we want some action, we want something to change after we've spoken. So in preparing your presentation, start with the end in mind and create great content that leads us to that next step. And the final, number 6 of creating great content is simply answer the 3 most frequently three questions you're asked most frequently. And I don't mind if it's 4 questions. And if you're talking about transitioning to retirement and you're a financial planner and you're before a group of people approaching retirement, what are the 3 most common questions you get asked? What are the 3 biggest concerns? If you're talking to a family with someone with a child with an intellectual disability that's about to finish their schooling, so they've had 15 years of structure, 15 years of going to school, and now they've got that end of school option and you just don't know what to do. What's going to happen? Are they going to be able to find a job? So if you answer those 3 most frequent questions, you'll have created great content and you'll probably have covered 90% of the audience's needs in terms of solving their problems, in removing their headaches. And it's a great structure because you already know the answer. You get asked these questions all the time over the telephone, via email. What are the 3 most important things I need to consider before I decide to retire? What do I need to consider before planning an overseas trip? What are the 4 steps to making sure my trip's a success? Answer those questions and you'll have great content from your audience's footsteps, from your audience's perspective. If you answer the 3 most common questions that you enjoy, that you love, and once again I'm in the audience and I don't care, then you won't have had the impact. So just remember, it's about the audience. It's putting the audience first. So in summary, 6 ways of creating great content, and there are others. Solve a problem, tell a story for the audience, needs to have benefit, needs to have value. Give people a way forward, show them the light at the end of the tunnel. Keep the message concise and targeted. Don't do scattergun approach. Have a clear next step or an action that people can take and need to take post-presentation. And finally, answer those 3 or 4 questions you are asked most often in your topic of expertise, or around a new policy that you're rolling out, or around a new way of doing business. What are the 3 questions that people come up with all the time? As you know, I run lots of workshops all around Australia. I've got some workshops in Mildura and also in Bendigo coming up in end of April, early May. They're not on the calendar yet, but you will find them on my website. If you know of anyone who may be interested, Karratha next week, a series of workshops in Karratha. And you know how to contact me. Send me an email if you have any further questions. I'll pause for a moment. We've still got a couple of minutes. You know my website. Follow me on Facebook. Connect with me on LinkedIn. Any last questions? So how do you know what the audience's problem is? And that's part of your preparation. And I use the acronym prior preparation prevents pathetically poor performance. And I use the metaphor walk 30 moons in your enemy's moccasins. You really need to know what it is that they want from you. Most of you know that I'm a person who stutters, and I lecture to speech pathology students once a year. They roll me out to talk about what it's like being a person who stutters and my journey through speech pathology to now doing public speaking for my living. One of the assignments that speech pathologists have to do, and they do it in pairs, and one day person A does it and one day person B does it. They have to spend a whole day on campus and they must stutter every time they talk. So when they order their coffee, when they speak in class, when someone asks them a question, when they're just walking around campus, and they've got their close colleague following them and observing them. And then the next day they swap and one becomes the observer. What the speech pathology students say is this is the most profound moment in their understanding of stuttering. And it equips them better to have that compassion, that connection, as they treat people who stutter. Now, from an ethical point of view, as a person who stutters, I think there's no ethical dilemma whatsoever. But these students have literally walked 30 moons or 12 hours in their clients' or their potential patients' footsteps. So that's what I mean by working out what the problem is. You need to dig deeper. All right, no further questions. I'm going to end the webinar.